All right, let's look at something that we have been discussing in your science classes since you were in kindergarten. Let's look at ecology. Now, the formal definition of ecology is the study of interactions between organisms and their environment. Now, when we look at the creatures that live in an area, they live in an area because of what type of soil is there? How much rain does it get? So when we look at ecology, not only do we have to look at the plants and animals, we have to look at, what's the weather like there? What's the soil like there? What's the temperature like there? So when we look at ecology, we look at what we call the biosphere. And the biosphere is the portion of Earth that supports all living things. And it goes from the highest point of the atmosphere all the way down to the bottoms of the oceans. And depending on where your lines of latitude and longitude are on Earth, that's going to help determine what can live in a certain area. Now, I just want to take a second to make sure that everybody understands the difference between weather and climate. Okay. You guys know that you tend to watch the weather from day to day. So it might be, 85 degrees outside one day, and then it's 65 degrees the next day. That is weather. Weather changes daily. And weather tends to be due to what's called the Coriolis effect and the jet stream. It's based on wind patterns. And because of the way that our Earth turns, it's going to have the atmosphere turning in a certain way. And I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. And so when we watch the weather, we tend to watch the weather go from left to right. And so we can tell the weather that's coming in from the west coast and it moves towards the east coast. And that's all based on weather patterns. So weather can change day to day just based on the wind patterns and humidity. Climate, however, is a yearly average, and climate is based on your location on Earth. So for example, here in North Carolina, our climate is what we call a temperate deciduous forest. We have our 4 seasons, and we might have cold winters, we might have hot summers. But if you look from year to year, the average amount of rain, the average temperature doesn't change. Pretty much the only thing that can really change climate is if a meteor hit the Earth and knock it in this weird sort of orbit. But because of weather patterns and temperature and climate, that can affect what lives in certain areas. So we have to look at what we call biotic and abiotic factors. Okay. Biotic factors, as you guys know, bio means life. Biotic factors are living organisms in the environment. So for example, this pig, any type of fungus, plants, it's the creatures that live there. And what determines what lives in a certain area are the plants. Because plants are our producers, they're at the bottom of our food chain, or at the start of our food chain, bottom of our food pyramid or energy pyramid. And the plants that live there determine what animals live there. So, the plants that live there will determine what type of insects live there, which will determine what eats the insects. So it comes down to plants. Well, what plants live in an area can be determined by the abiotic factors. So these are non-living things. So for example, what is the temperature? So obviously plants that live in the desert can withstand different temperatures than plants that live here in Raleigh, North Carolina. You can't really take animals and move them very easily from habitat to habitat because of the abiotic factors. So we also have to look at what's the soil like, Plants on the East Coast and the Outer Banks of North Carolina have to deal with sandy soil, while here in Raleigh, we have a lot of clay soil. So we're going to have different plants growing. So abiotic factors can determine how plants grow in a certain area. And then, based on what kind of plants live in a certain area, that's going to determine what kind of animals live in that area. So a change in abiotic factors may determine whether or not a species survives. So we are just going to look back at something that, again, you've probably talked about. When we look at ecosystems, we look at what we call levels of organization. And we start with an organism. And so an organism is just like one living thing. So for example, we have this one gazelle or antelope-like creature. So that's one organism. But when you have a lot of them all together in one group, that is what we call a population. So population would be all the zebras that live in this area, or all the gazelles that live in this area, or all whatever kind of fish is in that water that lives in that area. When you look at a population, you're looking at just one type of species. So if your school would be a population of humans, you could actually divide it into populations based on the classroom. So all the students in one classroom would be one population, and students in another classroom would be another population. But if you think about your classroom, other things are living in your classroom too. You might have pets in the classroom. Some teachers have fish, snakes, guinea pigs. You might have plants in your classroom, but I can guarantee it that there's bacteria, different types of fungi also living in your classrooms, different types of protists, you just can't see them. So when we look at all the different populations in one area, that's when we talk about a community. So in this picture, we would have a population of zebras. We'd have a population of the gazelle or antelope-like creatures. You'd have the population of whatever type of plants in that area, population of whatever type of fish that's in that water. But when we look at them all together, that's what we call the community. Now, when you look at the communities and the abiotic factors, you would have the ecosystem. So in this picture, you have the community of animals that includes the plants, but we'd also look at, okay, what's the soil like? How much rainfall does this area usually get? You know, what's the normal temperature in this area? And when you put those together, that's what's called an ecosystem. Now, several people have another term for ecosystem. You might know the term biome. So biome and ecosystem are the same thing. And the ecosystem, the biome, is named according to its climate. So for example, the polar regions are an example of an ecosystem or a biome. And by definition, they're actually deserts. To be a desert, you have a certain small amount of rainfall at a time. It's just in the polar biomes, it doesn't melt. Temperate deciduous forests, like here in North Carolina, we have the 4 seasons, very definite 4 seasons, and the tree deciduous means that our leaves fall off of our trees. You also have tundras, deserts. These are like examples of different types of ecosystems or different types of biomes. So when we look at ecosystems, we have what we call terrestrial ecosystems. So these would be like your grasslands, your temperate rainforest, your tropical rainforest, and just so you know the difference, tropical rainforests are near the equator. So tropical means that they stay warm pretty much all year long. Temperate rainforests, like in Washington State and Oregon, they are temperate rainforests. They still get a certain amount of rain every year, but temperate lets you know that their temperatures change. They do have their 4 seasons. We also have aquatic biomes or aquatic ecosystems, and these are just pretty much divided into 3 major groups. You have your freshwater, like lakes, ponds, and streams. You have your marine, which are your oceans, and then you have what we call your brackish or your estuaries. And this is where rivers dump fresh water into salt water. They're also called your deltas. So again, an organism is just one living thing, like our friend the cockroach here. And when I have a bunch of cockroaches running around, we've got ourselves a population. And when the cockroach decides to have his party and he invites all of his friends over, like the termites, the spiders, a gecko, we've got ourselves a community. And then when we add in the sun, you know, how much rain does it get? This represents your ecosystem. Now, when we look at an ecosystem, we have to look at where do these creatures live and what role do they play in their environment. So you guys probably remember this thing called a food chain, which we're going to look at later on. And a food chain is basically where, you know, so for example, grasses are our producers, and then whatever eats the grass, and then whatever eats those things, so on and so forth. So by definition, a niche is your role or position a species has in the environment. It's basically where do you fall on the food chain? Are you a producer? Are you a consumer? Are you a decomposer? Are you a primary consumer? Are you a secondary consumer? And these things, if you don't remember, will become more clear for you later on. A habitat is where you actually live. Okay? And so species can actually share a habitat as long as they have a different job. They can't have the same job and live in the same habitat, or that's going to lead to competition. And competition, as you know, leads to survival of the fittest. And it's very possible that one of these creatures could go extinct if that were the case. So that's just a review of something that you've talked about in many science classes. Remember, a producer is what we call an autotroph. When you produce something, you're making something. Auto means self, troph means to feed. So autotrophs are self-feeders. These are producers, and these are what things like plants, algae, certain types of bacteria. These are the creatures that have the ability to make their own food. And so the common example that we always use are plants, because they're going to produce sugar. They're going to produce food, and this is why they're called producers. Now they have to make it themselves, so this is why they're called autotrophs. Okay. Remember, animals, we have to eat food. We have to consume food. And so we're what we call heterotrophs, which means different feeders. We have to get our food from different places. And we can be classified according to what we eat. Now, you guys know that heterotrophs that feed on plants are called herbivores. Heterotrophs that eat other animals are called carnivores. And then creatures like us are what we call omnivores. Now, most people tend to forget about the other two, things called scavengers and decomposers. Scavengers eat animals that are already dead. They basically eat the leftovers. So things like vultures, hyenas, the lion goes and makes the kill, but the lion can't eat all that meat. And so then the hyenas or the vultures come in and eat the leftovers. But when the scavengers are done, there's still something left over. Now, it just might be the skeleton, but there's still something left behind. That's where our decomposers come into play. Decomposers are things like bacteria, certain types of fungi. They're actually going to totally break down that creature. So when it's all said and done, we are nutrients added back into the dirt. And so we have this huge passage of energy. The plants take the sun's light energy and use it to make sugar, then things eat the plants in order to get energy, and then things eat those things in order to get energy. So we have this passage of energy, and you guys are very familiar with pictures like this. This is what we call a food web. And you can see it's pretty confusing if you're trying to follow all these arrows around. So when we look at just like one possible pathway, as you know, that's what we call a food chain. Food chain shows us the pathway of energy. Now be careful when you look at food chains. Food chains always start with producers, and food chains always end with a larger consumer. Now at the end of every food chain is truly decomposers, but a lot of times you won't see them on the food chains. So again, as you're watching this, as you see, watch the arrows. Okay? The arrows will always point to what's doing the eating. So for example, energy is going from the plant to the caterpillar. Okay? The caterpillar is eating the plant. And then energy is going from the caterpillar to the frog. The frog is eating the caterpillar. And then energy goes from the frog to the snake. The snake's going to eat the frog. And then energy is going to go from the snake up to the owl. The owl's going to eat the snake. Now up here, eventually we know the owl will die. And so that's where our decomposers are going to come into play in order to break down the nutrients. So again, watch your arrows. The arrows will always show you what's doing the eating. So berries are passing nutrients to the mice, and mice are passing nutrients to the bear. Be careful with your arrows, okay? Because if your arrow goes this way, you're telling me that the berry is eating the mouse, and we know that plants can't eat. Now, food chains are just going to show one possible pathway, and food chains can be broken into different groups. Down at the bottom will always be your producers. Those are going to be the plants, the algae, the bacteria, whatever can do photosynthesis in order to produce sugar. And then what eats the plant is called a primary consumer. Primary meaning first. It's the first eater. And then whatever, and so in this case, this happens to be a grasshopper, an insect. Then whatever eats the primary, as you can see, is called the secondary, and eventually it works its way up. Now, every time you jump a trophic level, you actually lose energy. So most trophic levels don't have more than 4 or 5 creatures in their order. So again, most food chains consist of 2, 3, or 4 transfers because only a small portion of energy is transferred at each step. I always use money as my example. Only about 10% of energy gets passed on. So this plant did a lot of work doing photosynthesis, and this plant made $100. Well, it had to buy ingredients and all this stuff for itself. And when the week was said done, it only had $10 left. Now when this deer ate this plant, it only received $10. Well, that deer had to buy stuff for itself in order to survive. So when the week was done, it only had, let's say, 10 cents left. So when this wolf came along, it only had 10% of that energy. That's why the higher you get up in the food chain, the more creatures you have to eat in order to get all the energy that you need. When you put all the different possibilities together, this is what gives you this complex thing, as you guys know, which is a food web. Food web shows you a whole bunch of different food chains all together. And food webs, as you can see, can get really convoluted and confusing to try and follow all those arrows. So what we tend to do is just do what's called an ecological pyramid. This shows you the passage of energy. Now at the bottom of the pyramid will be plants, because plants are producers. They have to create that energy. Now they're going to use some of that energy for themselves. So as that energy gets passed up to the next level, some of that energy is going to get lost. And that would be our primary consumers. And then as the energy gets passed up to the next level, some energy gets lost. So it's like having, like I said, money. The producers have 100 pennies. Well, they have to spend some stuff themselves. So at the end of the week, when they get eaten, they only have 10 pennies left. Then the primary consumers have to spend some of that money on themselves. So at the end of the week, when they get eaten, they only have 1 penny left. So that's why the pyramid gets smaller and smaller and smaller as it goes up. So at the bottom of our pyramids, or at the start of our food chains, will always be producers. It will always be autotrophs. And then from there, you will have whatever eats those producers. So it'll be herbivores or omnivores. These are our primary consumers. And then on that will be whatever eats those, so omnivores and carnivores, that would be our secondary consumers, and then so on and so forth up our ecological pyramid. And like I mentioned again, I just use money. Only about 10% of energy is transferred from the next level. That's why it gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you go up the pyramid.